Tokyo, October 1946. A gunshot echoes through a crowded market. An American soldier collapses, blood spreading across his uniform. But the bullet wasn't meant for him. It was aimed at a young Japanese woman standing beside him, labeled a traitor by her own people. In that split second, Sergeant James Mitchell made a choice that would change everything. What happened next would become a story of redemption, courage, and the true meaning of honor in a world torn apart by hatred. The war had been over for more than a year, but Tokyo still carried its scars like open wounds. Rubble-lined streets stretched across neighborhoods where families once thrived. Makeshift shelters built from salvaged metal and scorched wood housed those who had nowhere else to go. American occupation forces patrolled the streets, their presence a constant reminder that Japan had lost everything, its empire, its pride, its future uncertain. Sergeant James Mitchell had arrived in Tokyo 3 months earlier as part of the occupation forces. At 27 years old, he had survived the brutal Pacific campaigns, island hopping through hell itself. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Okinawa. Each name carried memories he tried to forget. He had seen friends torn apart by artillery, watched young Marines take their last breaths on blood-soaked beaches, and carried the weight of every life lost in a war that seemed to have no end. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Jim felt relief mixed with horror. The war was over, but at a cost that haunted him. Now stationed in the defeated nation, he struggled with conflicting emotions. The enemy he had been trained to hate were now civilians he was supposed to help rebuild. Children with hollow eyes begging for food. Elderly people bowing respectfully to the soldiers who had destroyed their country. It was easier when they were just targets across a battlefield. Jim's assignment was to work with the Civil Information and Education section, helping implement democratic reforms and facilitating communication between occupation authorities and local Japanese officials. It was during one of these assignments that he first met Haruko Tanaka. She arrived at the headquarters building on a gray September morning, wearing a modest dark blue dress that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the circumstances. At 24, Haruko had graduated from a prestigious women's college before the war, one of the few Japanese women of her generation with advanced education in English literature and language. Captain Thomas Warren introduced her to the staff. "This is Miss Tanaka. She'll be working as a translator and liaison between our office and local municipal authorities. I expect everyone to treat her with the same respect you'd show any member of this team." Jim nodded politely, but inside, suspicion gnawed at him. A Japanese woman working for the Americans? What kind of person would betray their own country like that? He kept his distance at first, speaking to her only when necessary, his responses clipped and professional. But Haruko was impossible to ignore. She worked with meticulous attention to detail, translating documents with precision and navigating complex cultural misunderstandings with patience that impressed even the most cynical soldiers. More than once, Jim watched her defuse tense situations between American soldiers and Japanese civilians, her calm voice building bridges where only anger had existed. One afternoon, Jim overheard 2 sergeants talking about her in the barracks. "She's a traitor, plain and simple. Probably worked for the Americans during the war. How else would she speak English so well?" The other soldier nodded. "I heard her family disowned her. No respectable Japanese would collaborate like this." Jim said nothing, but the conversation stuck with him. That evening, he found himself watching Haruko as she packed her bag to leave the office. She moved with quiet efficiency, but he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her coat. When she thought no one was looking, exhaustion and sadness crossed her face like shadows. The next day, Jim made an effort to be less cold. When Haruko struggled to carry a heavy box of files, he stepped forward. "Let me help with that." She looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell." They worked in silence for a moment before Jim spoke again, his curiosity overcoming his reserve. "Why do you do this work, Miss Tanaka? It must be difficult." Haruko paused, choosing her words carefully. "My country is broken, Sergeant. Our leaders led us into a terrible war that brought unimaginable suffering. If I can help prevent more suffering, help my people rebuild and find a better path forward, then the difficulty is worth it." She met his eyes with surprising directness. "I don't expect everyone to understand. but I know what I'm doing is right." Her words challenged something deep inside Jim. He had assumed she was motivated by money or self-interest. Instead, he heard conviction and sacrifice. That conversation marked the beginning of a cautious friendship. Over the following weeks, Jim learned Haruko's story. Her father had been a professor who opposed the militarist government in the 1930s. He had spoken out against Japan's invasion of China and paid the price. The secret police arrested him in 1938, and he died in prison a year later. Her mother had passed away from illness in 1943, leaving Haruko to care for her younger sister Yuki. During the war, Haruko had worked as a translator for civilian agencies, helping with food distribution and medical services. When the Americans arrived, she saw an opportunity to help rebuild Japan in a way that honored her father's beliefs in democracy and peace. But that choice came at a terrible cost. The neighborhood where Haruko and Yuki lived had turned against them. Neighbors who had once been friendly now spat when Haruko walked by. Someone painted the word traitor on their door in red paint. Yuki, only 16, faced bullying at school. Students whispered that her sister was sleeping with American soldiers, that their family had no honor. The teenage girl came home crying more days than not. Jim didn't witness the worst of it himself, but he heard the reports. One morning, Captain Warren called him into his office. "We have a situation. Miss Tanaka was assaulted yesterday on her way home. 3 men surrounded her near the market, pushed her down and threw stones. She's bruised but refused medical treatment. She also refuses to file a report or identify the attackers." "Why not?" Jim asked, anger rising in his chest. "She says it would only make things worse. She's probably right. If we arrest Japanese civilians for attacking a woman they see as a collaborator, it could trigger riots." Warren rubbed his temples. "I want you to escort her to and from work. Make sure she gets home safely." Jim agreed immediately, though he worried what this would mean for Haruko. Being seen with an American military escort would only confirm suspicions in the minds of those who already hated her. When he informed Haruko of the arrangement, she protested. "That's not necessary, Sergeant Mitchell. I can take care of myself. With respect, Miss Tanaka, that's not what the bruises on your arm suggest. Captain's orders. I'll walk you home starting today." She sighed, recognizing she had no choice. "Very well. But please, we should maintain some distance. It will be easier for me if people don't think we're too friendly." Jim understood. He kept 10 paces behind her as they walked through the crowded streets of Tokyo. He wore civilian clothes instead of his uniform, trying to be less conspicuous. But his height, his features, his whole presence marked him as American. People stared. Some muttered insults. Haruko kept her head down and walked quickly. On the 3rd day of this arrangement, a group of young men blocked their path in a narrow alley. The leader, a thin man with hollow cheeks and burning eyes, stepped forward. He spoke in rapid Japanese that Jim couldn't understand, but the hostility needed no translation. Haruko responded in a calm but firm voice, trying to de-escalate. The confrontation might have ended there, but one of the young men spat at Haruko's feet. She flinched but didn't move. Jim stepped forward, positioning himself between Haruko and the group. "That's enough. We don't want any trouble." The leader sneered. "This doesn't concern you, American. This traitor shames Japan. She deserves punishment." Jim's jaw tightened. "Back away. Now." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air. Then one of the men noticed a police officer approaching, and the group dispersed. But not before the leader fixed Haruko with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over." After that incident, Jim began to see Haruko differently. She faced danger and hatred every single day, yet she continued her work with courage he could barely comprehend. She had more guts than half the soldiers he had served with. The walls he had built around his emotions began to crack. They started talking during their walks. Haruko told him about Tokyo before the war, a vibrant city of culture and life. She spoke of cherry blossom festivals, traditional theater, family gatherings. Jim shared carefully selected stories from his childhood in Ohio, his family's farm, his younger brother who had died at Iwo Jima. "I'm sorry," Haruko said softly when he mentioned his brother. "War takes so much from everyone." "Yeah," Jim agreed. "It does." One evening in mid-October, as they walked through a market district, Haruko stopped at a small stall selling sweet potatoes. "These were my father's favorite," she said quietly. "He used to buy them every week." The vendor, an elderly woman, recognized Haruko and turned away coldly, refusing to serve her. Haruko's face remained impassive, but Jim saw the pain in her eyes. He approached the vendor and purchased the sweet potatoes himself, then offered them to Haruko. She hesitated before accepting, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell. You're very kind. Call me Jim. I think we're past formalities." She smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "Then you must call me Haruko." That simple exchange marked a shift in their relationship. They were no longer just colleagues or escort in charge. They were friends, two people who had survived terrible wars and were trying to find meaning in the broken world that remained. But someone was watching their growing friendship with rage that festered like an infected wound. Hiroshi Yamamoto had once been a proud soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had fought in China, believing in the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, convinced that Japan's expansion would liberate Asia from Western imperialism. He had survived the brutal campaigns, the slow retreat, the humiliation of surrender. When he returned to Tokyo in early 1946, everything he had fought for was ashes. The Americans occupied his homeland, imposing their values, their democracy, their culture. Everywhere he looked, he saw defeat. What made it worse were the Japanese who collaborated with the occupiers, who betrayed their own people for scraps from the conqueror's table. Haruko Tanaka represented everything Hiroshi despised. A Japanese woman working for the Americans, walking beside American soldiers, smiling and laughing while Japan bled. She had no shame, no honor. People like her were the real enemy, more dangerous than the Americans themselves because they rotted Japan from within. Hiroshi began following her, watching her routine. He learned where she worked, where she lived, what routes she took through the city. He saw the American sergeant who escorted her, noticed how their relationship seemed to deepen. It made him sick. He wasn't alone in his hatred. Hiroshi had connected with other former soldiers, men who couldn't accept Japan's surrender, who still believed in the old ways. They met in secret, drinking sake and nursing their grievances. "Someone has to do something," one of them said. "We can't let these traitors destroy what's left of Japan." Hiroshi volunteered. "I'll handle the Tanaka woman. She needs to understand there are consequences for betraying your people." His friends provided him with a pistol, an old Type 14 Nambu that Hiroshi had hidden when he surrendered his weapons. It still worked. He cleaned it carefully, loaded it, and prepared himself. He wasn't a murderer, he told himself. He was a soldier doing what was necessary to protect Japan. October 22, 1946, dawned cold and gray. Jim met Haruko at the headquarters building as usual. She seemed troubled that morning, quieter than normal. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Yuki had another difficult day at school yesterday. Some boys cornered her and said terrible things. She came home crying." Haruko's voice was steady, but Jim heard the pain underneath. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish putting her through this." "You're not selfish, you're brave. What you're doing matters, Haruko." She gave him a weak smile. "I hope you're right." They walked through the market district, the same route they took every day. Vendors called out their wares. Children ran between stalls. American soldiers browsed alongside Japanese civilians in an uneasy coexistence. The occupation was working slowly to rebuild something from the ruins. Hiroshi waited in the shadow of a partially destroyed building. His hand gripped the pistol in his coat pocket. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Wait until they pass. Step out. Shoot the traitor. Disappear into the crowd. For Japan. For honor. He watched them approach. The American walked beside the woman now, not behind. They were talking, and she laughed at something he said. The sight filled Hiroshi with rage. She laughed while Japan suffered. Unforgivable. They were 10 meters away. 5 meters. This was it. Hiroshi stepped out from his hiding place, pulling the pistol from his pocket. His hand shook, but his resolve was steel. He raised the weapon, aiming at Haruko's back. Jim saw him first. Years of combat had honed his instincts. He registered the movement, the threat, the weapon in a fraction of a second. No time to think, only time to act. His body moved on pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless battles. He grabbed Haruko and spun, putting his body between her and the gunman. The pistol fired. The bullet struck Jim in the chest, just below his left shoulder. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. He stumbled backward, pulling Haruko down with him. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered. Haruko, pinned beneath Jim's weight, looked up at him in shock and horror. His blood was spreading across her dress. "Jim," she gasped. "Oh God, Jim." Hiroshi stood frozen, the smoking pistol in his hand. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The American had taken the bullet. He had saved her. Why would he do that? Why would an American die for a Japanese woman? Captain Warren and 2 other soldiers were nearby, having stopped at a vendor. They heard the shot and ran toward the commotion. Warren saw Jim on the ground, saw Hiroshi with the weapon, and drew his sidearm. "Drop it! Drop the weapon now!" Hiroshi's mind raced. He could run. He could shoot again. He could fight. But suddenly, it all seemed pointless. He looked at Haruko cradling the American soldier, her face streaked with tears, and something inside him broke. The pistol fell from his hand, clattering on the street. Soldiers tackled Hiroshi, pinning him down. Warren rushed to Jim's side. "Medic! We need a medic now!" Jim's breathing was labored, bubbling. The bullet had punctured his lung. He looked up at Haruko, who was pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Her hands were covered in his blood. "I'm okay," he managed to say. "You're okay. Why did you do that?" Haruko sobbed. "Why did you?" "Because," Jim coughed, wincing in pain. "Because you're my friend. Because it was the right thing to do." Medics arrived within minutes. They stabilized Jim enough to transport him to the military hospital. Haruko refused to leave his side, riding in the ambulance with him despite protests from the MPs. Her dress was soaked with blood, her hands shaking, but her voice was steady as she held Jim's hand and whispered in his ear, "Stay with me, Jim. Please stay with me. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." The surgery took 4 hours. The bullet had lodged near Jim's lung, missing his heart by centimeters. The surgeons removed it and repaired the damage, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Captain Warren found Haruko in the waiting room, still covered in Jim's blood. "Miss Tanaka, you should go home. Clean up. We'll notify you when there's news." She shook her head. "I'm staying." Warren didn't argue. He sat beside her in silence for a moment before speaking. "He saved your life. I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't understand why." "Because that's who Jim is," Warren said. "He's one of the best men I've ever served with. Doesn't matter if you're American or Japanese, friend or stranger. He does what's right." Haruko wiped tears from her face. "What will happen to the man who shot him? He's in custody. He'll face charges. Attempted murder." Warren paused. "He says he was trying to kill you, not Jim. He's a former Imperial Army soldier. Apparently there's a group of them who can't accept the surrender, see collaborators as the real enemy." Haruko absorbed this information. "How many others are there like him? We don't know. But this incident has made it clear we need better protection for Japanese civilians working with occupation forces. This should never have happened. I'm sorry, Miss Tanaka." Jim survived the night. And the next. Slowly, his condition stabilized. When he finally woke up 3 days after the shooting, the first face he saw was Haruko's. She had barely left the hospital, sleeping in chairs, refusing to go home despite Yuki's pleas. "Hey," Jim croaked, his voice rough. "You look terrible." Haruko laughed through fresh tears. "You're one to talk. You were shot, you fool." "Yeah, I noticed. Hurts like hell." Jim tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "How long was I out?" 3 days. "The doctors say you're very lucky. The bullet missed your heart by this much." She held her fingers close together. "Guess I should buy a lottery ticket." Jim's attempt at humor fell flat. His expression grew serious. "Haruko, are you okay? Did that guy hurt you?" "I'm fine. Thanks to you." She squeezed his hand gently. "Jim, why did you do it? You could have died. Could ask you the same thing. Why do you keep working with us knowing people want to kill you for it?" She considered his question. "Because it's right. Because Japan needs to change. Needs to build something better than what came before. Because I believe in a future where this kind of hatred doesn't exist." Jim smiled weakly. "There's your answer then. Same reason." The shooting became news across occupied Japan and even reached newspapers in America. An American soldier taking a bullet meant for a Japanese woman. It was a story that captured imaginations, a symbol of reconciliation and humanity in a time of division. But for those directly involved, it was much more complicated. Jim's recovery was slow and painful. Weeks in the hospital, then months of physical therapy. The bullet had done significant damage and he would carry the scar for the rest of his life. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor, a ceremony that felt surreal to him. He hadn't been thinking about medals when he moved. He just acted on instinct, protecting someone who mattered to him. Haruko continued her work, despite pressure from Captain Warren to take time off. If I stop now, the people who tried to kill me win. I won't give them that satisfaction. But the shooting had changed her. She was more cautious, more aware of the dangers. The innocence was gone, replaced by a harder, more resilient strength. The incident also sparked wider changes. The occupation authorities implemented better security measures for Japanese employees. They launched investigations into extremist groups. And perhaps most importantly, it started conversations about reconciliation, about moving beyond the hatred of war toward a shared future. Hiroshi Yamamoto faced trial in December 1946. Haruko attended, sitting in the courtroom as the prosecutor outlined the charges. Hiroshi showed no emotion during most of the proceedings, but when Haruko took the stand, something shifted. She spoke about the work she did, why she believed in it, and what she hoped for Japan's future. She also spoke about Jim, about his courage and sacrifice. Sergeant Mitchell didn't know me well when he saved my life. We came from countries that had been enemies, cultures that had been taught to hate each other. But in that moment, he saw me as a human being worth protecting. He chose compassion over hate, action over indifference. That is the kind of world I want to help build. A world where we see each other as human beings first. When she finished, Hiroshi looked at her with an expression that might have been shame. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison, a significant punishment that sent a message about vigilante violence. But the real punishment, Hiroshi would later admit, was living with the knowledge that his hatred had nearly killed an innocent woman and had wounded a man who embodied more honor than he had shown. Jim was discharged from the hospital in January 1947. His military service was extended to accommodate his recovery, but he knew his combat days were over. The injury had changed him physically, but also emotionally. He had found a purpose beyond fighting. He requested a transfer to the Civil Affairs section, working full-time on reconstruction and education programs. His friendship with Haruko deepened during his recovery. She visited him daily, bringing books and news from the office. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Philosophy, literature, the future. They debated democracy and tradition, American pragmatism versus Japanese aesthetics. They argued and laughed and gradually became each other's closest confidant. One February evening, as cherry blossom trees began to show the first hints of spring, Jim asked Haruko to walk with him. He was still recovering, moving slowly, but determined to rebuild his strength. They found themselves in a park that had survived the bombing, a small oasis of nature in the urban devastation. "I've been thinking," Jim said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, "about what happens next. My service commitment ends in a few months. I'll have to decide whether to go home or stay." "What do you want to do?" Haruko asked, though her tone suggested she feared the answer. "Honestly, I don't know if I can go back. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed before the war, it all seems distant now, like it happened to a different person." Jim paused, gathering courage. "But I know that leaving Japan, leaving you, would feel like abandoning something important, something I need to see through." Haruko stopped walking. "Jim, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the bullet didn't just save your life. Maybe you saved mine too. Gave me a reason to be better, to fight for something more than just survival." He turned to face her. "I want to stay, Haruko, if you'll have me, as a friend, as whatever you want. I just know I can't imagine my future without you in it." Tears streamed down Haruko's face, but this time they were tears of joy mixed with fear. "My life is dangerous, Jim. Today it's better, but who knows what tomorrow brings. Anyone close to me is at risk. I took a bullet for you already. Kind of established I'm willing to take that risk." She laughed through her tears. "You're impossible, you know that. So I've been told. Is that a yes?" Haruko stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "Yes, Jim Mitchell, that's a yes." Their relationship scandalized some and inspired others. A romance between an American soldier and a Japanese woman was not unheard of during the occupation, but theirs carried extra significance because of the shooting. They became symbols, whether they wanted to be or not, of the possibility of healing and moving forward. Jim did stay in Japan, taking a civilian position with the Occupation Administration. He and Haruko married in a small ceremony in June 1947, attended by Captain Warren, Haruko's sister Yuki, and a handful of close friends from both American and Japanese communities. The ceremony blended traditions from both cultures, a fitting metaphor for their relationship. Yuki, who had struggled so much with the hatred directed at her sister, found hope in their union. If Jim, an American soldier, could love Haruko enough to die for her, maybe the hatred could end. Maybe Japan and America could build something new together. She threw herself into her studies with renewed purpose, eventually becoming a teacher dedicated to promoting understanding between cultures. The impact of that October day rippled outward in ways Jim and Haruko never expected. The story of the shooting was taught in schools as an example of courage and sacrifice. Veterans from both sides, American and Japanese, cited it as a turning point in their own journeys toward healing. Letters poured in from people who had lost faith in humanity and found it restored by knowing that someone would risk everything for a stranger. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Hiroshi Yamamoto. In prison, he had time to reflect on his actions and beliefs. A prison chaplain, himself a former soldier, worked with him extensively. They discussed honor, duty, and the difference between loyalty and blind hatred. Slowly, painfully, Hiroshi began to understand that his hatred had blinded him to truth. In 1952, Haruko did something that shocked everyone. She visited Hiroshi in prison. She didn't owe him forgiveness. He had tried to kill her, had nearly succeeded in killing the man she loved. But Haruko believed in the principles she had fought for: redemption, reconciliation, moving forward rather than remaining trapped in cycles of revenge. Their conversation lasted 2 hours. Hiroshi apologized, tears streaming down his face for what he had tried to do. "I was wrong. About everything. You weren't a traitor. You were trying to save Japan in the only way you knew how. I'm the one who betrayed Japan by clinging to hatred when we needed healing." Haruko accepted his apology with grace. "What you did was terrible. But I also understand that war destroys us in so many ways. It makes us into people we never thought we'd become. The question is whether we can find our way back." When Hiroshi was released in 1961, having served his full sentence, he emerged into a Japan transformed. The country had rebuilt economically and culturally. The scars of war remained, but prosperity and peace were taking root. Hiroshi dedicated the rest of his life to working with veterans organizations, helping former soldiers cope with trauma and reintegrate into society. He spoke publicly about his crime and his transformation, using his story to warn others about the dangers of unchecked hatred. Jim and Haruko built a life together that bridged 2 worlds. They had 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both American and Japanese contexts. Jim worked in education and civil society development, helping strengthen democratic institutions in Japan. Haruko became a professor of English literature, teaching a new generation of Japanese students and writing about the importance of cultural exchange. As the years passed and Japan's economic miracle took hold, the couple watched with satisfaction as the country they loved rose from the ashes to become a global leader in technology, culture, and peace. The U.S.-Japan alliance, once an occupation, evolved into a genuine partnership. The hatred and suspicion that had defined the immediate post-war years gradually gave way to mutual respect and friendship. In 1976, on the 30th anniversary of the shooting, Jim and Haruko were invited to speak at a peace conference in Hiroshima. Standing before an international audience with Hiroshi Yamamoto sitting in the front row, Jim reflected on that October day. "I didn't think when I moved to protect Haruko. I just acted. But looking back now, I realize that moment represented a choice we all have to make. Do we let hatred and division define us? Or do we choose something better? Do we see each other as enemies or as human beings capable of compassion and growth?" That split-second decision changed my life, but the real miracle is that it changed other lives too. It became part of a larger story about how former enemies can become partners and friends. Haruko spoke next, her voice strong and clear. "The world told us we should hate each other. Our governments had sent millions to die in a terrible war. But we discovered something more powerful than hate: We discovered that courage means standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous. That honor means protecting the vulnerable even when they're supposed to be your enemy. And that love can bridge any divide if we're brave enough to let it. The audience, composed of peace activists, former soldiers, and young people who had never known war, rose in a standing ovation. In that moment, Jim and Haruko represented everything the post-war generation hoped for, proof that reconciliation was possible, that the wounds of history could heal. Jim lived to see the turn of the millennium, passing away peacefully in 2001 at the age of 82. Haruko held his hand as he took his final breaths, just as she had held it in that market in 1946 when his blood soaked her dress. "We had a good life, didn't we?" he whispered. "The best," she replied. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." After Jim's death, Haruko continued their work, speaking at schools and conferences about reconciliation, cultural understanding, and the power of individual courage to change history. She lived to be 93, passing away in 2015 surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who embodied the best of both cultures. The spot where Jim took the bullet eventually became a small memorial park. A plaque tells the story in both English and Japanese, a reminder to future generations that even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail. Every October 22nd, people gather there to lay flowers and reflect on the sacrifices that made peace possible. The story of Sergeant James Mitchell and Haruko Tanaka is more than a tale of one heroic moment. It's a testament to the truth that wars end not with treaties and occupations, but in the hearts of individuals who choose compassion over hatred. Jim's split-second decision to step in front of a bullet saved one life, but the ripples from that moment touched thousands. Their 3 children all pursued careers dedicated to public service. Their eldest daughter became a diplomat, facilitating U.S.-Japan relations. Their son worked with refugee organizations, helping displaced people rebuild their lives. Their youngest daughter became a physician, providing medical care in conflict zones around the world. Each carried forward the legacy of their parents, proof that love and courage can create change that echoes through generations. Hiroshi Yamamoto, who lived until 2010, never forgot the mercy shown to him by the woman he tried to kill. His work with veterans helped hundreds of former soldiers find peace and purpose after war. At his funeral, Haruko spoke about forgiveness and second chances. She reminded the mourners that Hiroshi's transformation proved that no one is beyond redemption, that even those who have committed terrible acts can change and contribute to healing. The lessons from that October day in 1946 remain relevant. In a world still divided by conflict, nationalism, and hatred, the story reminds us that individuals have power. One person choosing compassion over hate, action over indifference, can spark movements that change everything. Jim Mitchell didn't save Haruko because of grand political ideology. He saved her because she was his friend, a human being in danger. That simple act of humanity became revolutionary. As we look back 79 years later, we see a world transformed. Japan and the United States, once bitter enemies, are now close allies. The scars of World War II remain, but they no longer define the relationship between these nations. That transformation happened because of big political decisions, yes, but also because of countless small moments of courage and compassion. Moments like an American soldier taking a bullet for a Japanese woman. Moments like that woman choosing to forgive the man who tried to kill her. The story challenges us to ask ourselves difficult questions. Who would we risk our lives to protect? Can we see humanity in those we've been taught to hate? Are we capable of forgiveness when we've been deeply wronged? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical challenges we face every day in a world still grappling with division, conflict, and hatred. Jim and Haruko's descendants continue to tell their story, keeping alive the memory of that October day and everything that followed. Their grandchildren speak at schools, write books, and create documentaries about the power of reconciliation. They remind new generations that peace isn't inevitable or natural. It requires courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to see enemies as potential friends. The Memorial Park in Tokyo has become a pilgrimage site for those interested in peace studies and conflict resolution. Visitors from around the world come to stand where Jim fell, where Haruko cradled him, where one bullet changed 2 lives and eventually touched millions. They leave flowers, write messages in the memorial book, and take away the lesson that individual actions matter. In 2016, on the 70th anniversary of the shooting, the governments of Japan and the United States jointly sponsored a ceremony at the memorial. Officials from both nations spoke about the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance and how it rests on a foundation built by people like Jim and Haruko. Young people from both countries read essays about what the story meant to them, how it inspired them to work for peace and understanding in their own contexts. One young Japanese woman, herself named Haruko, spoke through tears. My grandmother told me this story when I was a child. She said that the greatest courage isn't fighting in wars. It's choosing peace when everyone around you chooses hate. Choosing to trust when you've been given every reason not to. Jim and Haruko showed us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're guided by compassion instead of fear. An American student, a descendant of Pacific War veterans, added his perspective. My great-grandfather fought in the Pacific. He carried hatred for Japan until the day he died. But hearing this story made me realize that hatred only perpetuates suffering. Jim Mitchell, who fought in the same war as my great-grandfather, chose a different path. He chose to see Haruko as a person, not an enemy. That choice broke the cycle. I want to honor my great-grandfather's service while also embracing Jim's vision of reconciliation. These testimonies illustrate how Jim and Haruko's story continues to resonate across generations. It provides a counter-narrative to the cycles of revenge and hatred that define so much of human history. It proves that another way is possible. The documentary about their lives, produced by their grandson in 2018, won International Film Awards and introduced their story to millions who had never heard it. The film includes interviews with historians, family members, and Hiroshi Yamamoto's children, who speak candidly about their father's crime and redemption. It doesn't shy away from the complexity of the story, the real costs of war, the difficulties of forgiveness, the ongoing work of reconciliation, but it ultimately celebrates the triumph of human compassion over the forces that divide us. One of the most powerful moments in the documentary comes from an interview conducted with Haruko just months before her death. At 93, her body was frail, but her mind remained sharp. She sat in her garden surrounded by cherry blossom trees and reflected on her life. People ask me if I ever regretted the choices I made, working with the Americans, marrying Jim, becoming a symbol of reconciliation. The answer is no, never. Was it difficult? Absolutely. Was it dangerous? Yes. Did we face prejudice and hatred? More than I can describe. But we also experienced love, friendship, and the satisfaction of knowing we contributed to something larger than ourselves. We helped build peace, not just between nations, but between people. That's worth any sacrifice. As the sun set on that interview, casting golden light across her garden, Haruko offered her final thoughts. If my story teaches anything, I hope it's this. We're not prisoners of history. The hatred and divisions of the past don't have to define our future. Every day we wake up with a choice. Will we perpetuate old hatreds, or will we choose compassion? Will we see walls, or will we see bridges? Jim chose to build a bridge that day in October, and I spent my life trying to widen it so others could cross. That work isn't finished. Every generation has to choose again. I hope they choose wisely. Haruko passed away 2 weeks after that interview, her final words becoming her legacy. At her funeral, attended by hundreds including Japanese and American officials, her children shared stories that illustrated how she lived those principles every day, how she welcomed everyone into her home regardless of background, how she taught her students to question prejudices and seek common humanity, how she never let bitterness take root, even when she had every reason to be bitter. The story of that October day in 1946 and everything that flowed from it reminds us that history pivots on individual choices. Jim Mitchell could have stepped aside. Haruko Tanaka could have given up her work. Hiroshi Yamamoto could have remained consumed by hatred. But each of them, at critical moments, made choices that bent the arc of their lives and many others toward reconciliation, rather than continued conflict. In our current age, when nationalism and division seem resurgent, when old hatreds are reignited and new ones created, we need stories like this more than ever. We need reminders that another path exists, that enemies can become friends, that wounds can heal, that individuals have power to resist the tides of hatred and choose something better. Jim and Haruko's story isn't just history. It's a roadmap for anyone who wants to build bridges instead of walls, who wants to see possibilities instead of limitations, who believes that compassion is stronger than hate. It challenges us to ask what bullets we're willing to take for others, what risks we're willing to accept for the sake of what's right. As we conclude this remarkable story, we're left with questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. Would we have the courage Jim showed? Would we have the resilience Haruko demonstrated? Would we be capable of the transformation Hiroshi underwent? These questions aren't hypothetical. Every day presents opportunities to choose compassion over indifference, action over passivity, reconciliation over revenge. The memorial in Tokyo bears an inscription in both Japanese and English. It reads, "On this spot, October 22, 1946, Sergeant James Mitchell of the United States Army took a bullet meant for Haruko Tanaka of Japan. His courage saved her life. Her response honored his sacrifice. Together they built a bridge of friendship that thousands have crossed. May their example light the way for future generations seeking peace. That light continues to shine, passed from generation to generation, reminding us that in our darkest moments, humanity can still prevail. One bullet, 2 lives, millions touched. That's the power of choosing love over hate, courage over fear, and hope over despair." If you found this story of courage, sacrifice, and redemption inspiring, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Give this video a like if you believe in the power of individual choices to change the world, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this remarkable story of reconciliation. What would you be willing to sacrifice for what's right? Let us know below.